Thank you for agreeing to judge this year's World Individual Public Speaking and Debating Championships. An event like this would not be possible without kind people like yourself giving up your time to listen to speeches, readings, and debates. So thank you very much on behalf of the coaches and the competitors. The first thing I'd like to mention is that you should relax. If you're already relaxed, great. If, on the other hand, you're nervous because you haven't judged before or haven't judged this event before, please don't be. The purpose of the activity that the students are involved in is to be able to convince, persuade, entertain a representative audience. If the only person who can tell that they did a good job is a specially trained coach or judge, then it's no longer a life skill. So this is something that you are inherently qualified to judge. If it strikes you that that was a really good speech and you'd happily have that student give a speech on behalf of a cause that mattered to you or do a reading that was important to you, then they did a good job and they deserve a high mark. If you couldn't really follow what they were saying or it was complicated and didn't make a lot of sense, then they didn't do a good job, regardless of the rhetorical devices involved or the classical structure of the speech. It didn't work, and therefore it wasn't good. So the nice thing about judging, debating, and public speaking is that whatever your gut instinct is probably right. There are a few things, though, that you do need to bear in mind when you're judging. The first is that you should not be concerned about technicalities. At some point, someone may have said, oh, you should always start a speech by saying, honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen, or you may not have heard that or may not think that's a good idea. We're not worried about that. In debates, they may refer to the House or the government or the side in favor. It really doesn't matter. We're concerned with the quality of their speeches, the quality of their arguments, not whether or not they do a set series of things. In the same way, you should ignore things like accents. Both, if it's an accent you don't happen to like, please put that aside. That's not their fault. Or if they're doing something like a reading and you've always thought of it as a piece that's done with an English accent, but they don't use an English accent, please put that aside and say, well, all right, did it work? You also need to be neutral. That means neutral about the topic. It may be a topic like climate change or political correctness, on which you have very strong views. Please put those aside and ask yourself, all right, if you were someone who was neutral, would this be convincing? Would this be effective? You may have specialized knowledge. Again, you should put that aside. So if they're making an argument about something to do with the legal system and you happen to be a lawyer, please don't let that influence your decision, but rather ask yourself, would this be convincing to the general public? If they'd been designing a speech aimed at lawyers, it would have been a somewhat different speech. Likewise, don't worry about the approach that they take, their style. It may not be a style that you usually think of being associated with impromptu speaking or with persuasive speaking, but did it work? Again, that's always the standard you go back to. Time. All of these events do have time limits. You as a judge, though, don't really need to be concerned with them. There are time penalties if they go outside of these time limits, but all we ask you to do is to note the time down on the ballot. Also note down if something unusual happened. The stopwatch stopped, for instance, or if it was a live event, Zoom kicked the person out. Obviously, anything like that would be taken into account. We wouldn't have any time penalties. If there are time penalties, though, you don't assess them, and you don't even really need to worry about them. Just make sure you write the time down on the ballot, and then the tabulation room will take that into account. Another way that time affects the speeches is, of course, that you have to consider how much time the students have to work on a particular topic. For instance, if they're doing an impromptu speech or a debate, And well, an impromptu speech, they only have 2 minutes to get ready. A debate, they have 20 to 30 minutes. But in that time, they are not allowed to use any outside material. It's just what they know. So when you're judging those events, take that into account. Given that they had such a limited time to prepare, did they do a good job? In persuasive speaking, you might think to yourself, oh, it would have been even better if they'd expanded on something. And that could be a very reasonable comment. But if their speech was already 12 minutes long, you also have to ask yourself, would it have been worthwhile dropping something else in the speech, because they would have had to have done that to fit into the time, in order to include this expansion on whatever it was you were thinking. So please take into account the time limits. The same thing applies to the reading. You might want a longer introduction, but if they were approaching the maximum time in the reading, they might have had difficulty doing that, simply because they would have had to have edited something out, stopped at a different point in the reading, and they may have decided that's not worthwhile. The ballots. The ballots are online, of course, and you will have been sent the link to the ballots for the events that you are judging. We would suggest that you actually note things down on a piece of paper as you're judging, whether it's an asynchronous event, in other words, one that has been recorded and that you're watching later, or a synchronous event, which is a live event like impromptu speaking or debating. So it's worthwhile having a piece of paper and jotting notes down, and perhaps even jotting a score down on that piece of paper. You don't want to be filling out the ballots as you're listening to the speech, because there may be things that you want to change, and that can be very tricky online. If you do submit the ballot and you think afterwards you need to make a change, please email the organizers and let them know, and they will see if they can accommodate that. But it's obviously better if you take your notes down on a piece of paper and only fill out the ballots when you're actually ready to enter your scores and your comments. The range of scores. A couple of things about that are very important. The first is it may be different from what you might be used to. So in some countries, for instance, 70 is actually quite a good score. In other countries, 99 is not that unusual a score. It's obviously crucial for this event that you use the ranges applicable to this tournament. So that may take some adjusting. If you're used to judging world schools, for instance, 80 is the top score possible, the equivalent of a 95 at this tournament. And so please take that into account. The other thing about the scores is that we're interested in the overall score. In some tournaments, you will often have a score sheet that gives you subcategories, and you pay close attention to those subcategories. So style, organization, pace, a series of things like that. For this event, we'd like you to take those into account, but we want you to put together a holistic score. So a single number that reflects the overall effectiveness of the student. So what would that single score be? Well, 95 is the top score at the tournament. No one can get a score higher than 95. 95 means you're saying you cannot imagine a high school student ever doing a better job in that event. Conceivably, you might see 1, even 2. You're unlikely to see 10, although the students will think you're a wonderful judge and really like the 95s. So please restrict 95 to that exceptional individual, and there's a good chance you won't give a single 95 in the course of the tournament. A score in the 90s means it was excellent. You were delighted to listen to that student. You would happily listen to them again, and you would be delighted to have them as an advocate for a cause that you believed in, or doing a reading that you thought was very important, and that student would do it justice. Score in the 90s means there may have been a few areas that could have been improved, but they were relatively minor, and overall, fabulous job. 85 to 89 means it was very good. You were still happy to be listening to this student. They still did a great job in whatever it was they were doing. But there were some significant areas for improvement. A number of things that they could have done better, and that would have made a substantial difference to their presentation. 80 to 84 means it was okay. As you're getting towards 84, it's approaching the very good, so it was good, but there was still probably a significant number of areas that could have been notably better. 80 was okay. They did what they were supposed to. You wouldn't mind listening to this person again, but you wouldn't be especially enthusiastic about it either. You wouldn't want them giving a speech at an event that was important to you, but it wouldn't be a terrible thing if they happened to. 75 to 79, you do not want to listen to that person again. Something went drastically wrong. They seem to misunderstand the event. If they were arguing for something, you're now against it. And you would definitely not want to have that student as a speaker or a reader at something that was important to you. 70 to 75, something went drastically wrong. It was not good at all, unpleasant to listen to. You would schedule major dental work rather than listen to this student again. You absolutely would not want to have them as your representative at something that was important to you. In terms of persuasive speaking, that's the kind of person you'd want to have arguing against you. 70 is the lowest possible score. They get 70 for turning up. So please bear that in mind. Comments. You do have an opportunity to make comments to the students. In the case of the asynchronous, that is the recorded events, those comments would be written down on the ballots. They are optional. It's entirely up to you. And they would be returned to the competitors at the end of the competition. For the synchronous events, and so those are the ones that are live on Zoom, impromptu speaking or debating, if there's time, there may be an opportunity to give comments at the end of the debate or once everyone has finished their impromptu speeches. The students really like receiving comments, so we would encourage you to give comments with a couple of caveats. The first is that your comments should not reveal the results either directly, you got 92, or indirectly, that was an incredible job. I can't imagine anyone doing a better job, to one student, and keep trying. It's never hopeless to another. They'll work out who did the best in the room and who didn't. What we suggest is that you say one thing that they did well and one thing that they could work on. And when you're mentioning the thing that they could work on, please try and do it constructively, supportively. For instance, don't say their organization was terrible. Rather say the speech would have been even more effective if they'd spent a bit more time and effort on the organization. That would have made it even better. They'll get the message, and yet they're still going to be supported and encouraged. You will have links to video briefings for the specific events, and there's a different briefing for each event. And those will go into the details for those events. But whatever the event, please remember that range of scores, because that's the crucial number that matters in terms of the results of the tournament. Thank you again for your help, and we hope you enjoy the competition.